She handed divorce papers to the quiet, humble man she'd shared 5 years with. The one who drove a modest sedan and wore the same 3 suits on rotation, never knowing he was actually the multi-billionaire phantom owner who controlled every boardroom, every decision, every promotion at the very company where she clocked in each morning. Sarah Chen had fallen for Marcus Reed's best friend, the charismatic VP who flashed designer watches and promised her the executive life she craved, completely unaware that the man she was leaving in their tiny apartment actually signed her paychecks from the shadows. Marcus had built an empire worth $47 billion while pretending to be a mid-level consultant, watching his wife climb the corporate ladder he secretly owned. But when she chose his best friend, the man he'd trusted with his darkest secrets, over their marriage, something inside the hidden titan finally snapped. He'd spent years protecting her from the brutal truth of his wealth, the enemies it created, the isolation it demanded. But now the woman who divorced him for lack of ambition and the best friend who'd betrayed him for love were about to discover why Marcus Reed had stayed hidden for so long. What did Marcus do when the 2 people he loved most destroyed him? How does a multi-billionaire who controls everything exact revenge on those who never knew his true power? And what happened when Sarah finally discovered her ex-husband's real identity and realized what she truly lost? The fluorescent lights of Hartwell Industries flickered as Jennifer Morrison gathered her courage in the corner office bathroom, staring at her reflection with a mixture of determination and disgust. Outside, the city stretched beneath the 42nd floor like a kingdom she'd never quite conquered, despite 5 years of clawing her way from junior analyst to senior project manager. Her phone buzzed again with another message from Blake Davidson, the vice president whose corner office sat 3 floors above hers, whose cologne cost more than her monthly grocery budget, whose attention had become an addiction she could no longer resist. She read his words for the 3rd time that morning, each syllable a promise of the life she'd always deserved, but never received from the man waiting at home. The man who still lived in that cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, the man who drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked windshield, the man whose idea of ambition was watching documentary films about architecture on Friday nights while eating microwave dinners. Thomas Morrison had been safe once, comfortable in his predictability, acceptable in his mediocrity. But safety had become suffocation, and Jennifer had finally met someone who understood that life was meant to be lived in penthouses, not prison cells disguised as starter apartments. She'd met Thomas 7 years ago at a company mixer, back when Hartwell Industries was just another corporation on her resume, and he was a consultant brought in to analyze operational efficiency. He'd been heavier then, almost obese, his shirt stretching across a belly that spoke of too many takeout meals and not enough discipline. But his eyes had been kind, genuinely kind in a way that felt foreign in the cutthroat world of corporate advancement. He'd made her laugh with self-deprecating humor about his weight, about his lack of social graces, about how he'd rather crunch numbers than make small talk. Jennifer had been recovering from a brutal breakup with an investment banker who cheated on her with his assistant, and Thomas's gentle attention had felt like balm on an open wound. They dated for 18 months before he proposed with a modest diamond ring that probably cost him 3 months of salary, and she'd said yes because he was stable, reliable, and utterly devoted to her happiness. The wedding had been small, intimate, everything her mother said a wedding should be when the groom wasn't wealthy enough for extravagance. Thomas had cried during his vows, promised her the world even though they both knew his salary cap was probably somewhere around $80,000 a year. She'd believed him then, believed that love could compensate for ambition, that partnership could substitute for passion. The first 3 years had been acceptable. Thomas worked long hours for various consulting firms, never staying anywhere longer than a contract required, always explaining that he preferred the flexibility of project-based work. Jennifer had found it strange that someone so analytically brilliant seemed content with perpetual temporary employment, but she'd attributed it to his lack of drive, his comfort with mediocrity. Meanwhile, her own career had flourished in ways she couldn't quite explain. Promotions came faster than expected, projects landed on her desk with perfect timing, executives noticed her contributions with surprising frequency. By year 4, she was earning significantly more than Thomas, a fact that initially embarrassed her, but eventually became a source of resentment. She was supporting them both on her income while he continued his consulting gigs that barely covered his personal expenses. The apartment stayed small because Thomas insisted they didn't need more space. The car stayed old because he claimed reliable transportation mattered more than appearance. The restaurant stayed cheap because he genuinely preferred hole-in-the-wall ethnic places to Michelin-starred establishments. Jennifer began to feel like she was drowning in his contentment, suffocating under his lack of ambition. Then Blake Davidson arrived at Hartwell Industries 6 months ago, hired as the new vice president of strategic development, and everything changed. Blake was everything Thomas wasn't. Tall where Thomas was average height, athletic where Thomas remained stubbornly overweight, despite Jennifer's hints about gym memberships. Charismatic where Thomas was awkwardly sincere. Blake wore custom suits and drove a Tesla, lived in a Tribeca loft and vacationed in Saint-Tropez. He noticed Jennifer immediately, complimented her presentation at a board meeting, invited her to drinks after a successful project launch. The affair began 3 months ago in his office after everyone else had gone home. Champagne and ambition mixing into something that felt like destiny rather than betrayal. Blake understood her hunger for more, validated her frustration with Thomas's complacency, promised her a life of luxury if she'd only have the courage to leave the dead weight holding her back. He'd been surprisingly direct about his intentions, explaining that he'd been watching her for months, that he saw her potential trapped beneath the burden of an unmotivated husband. Jennifer had resisted at first, the guilt of betrayal warring with the intoxication of being truly seen by someone who mattered. But Blake was persistent, and his persistence felt like the romantic pursuit she'd never experienced with Thomas, who'd always been too grateful for her presence to properly chase her affection. The decision to divorce had crystallized 2 weeks ago, during a particularly mundane evening, when Thomas suggested they celebrate her recent promotion with homemade pasta and a documentary about the Panama Canal. Jennifer had stared at this man who thought Netflix and carbohydrates constituted celebration, who had no idea that her promotion meant she was now earning $200,000 annually, who couldn't comprehend that she deserved champagne on rooftops rather than marinara sauce on secondhand furniture. She'd told him that night, words spilling out with more venom than she'd intended, accusations about his lack of ambition, poisoning what should have been a simple conversation about growing apart. Thomas had gone very still, his expression shifting from confusion to something else, something she couldn't quite read. He'd asked if there was someone else, his voice carefully neutral, and Jennifer had been honest because she was done with pretending. Yes, there was someone else, someone successful, someone who understood what it meant to actually want something from life. Thomas had nodded slowly, then asked if she was certain this was what she wanted. When she'd confirmed, he'd simply said he'd make the arrangements easy for her, that he'd never wanted to be an obstacle to her happiness. The divorce papers had been drawn up with surprising speed, Thomas's lawyer handling everything with an efficiency that seemed out of character for someone so supposedly unmotivated. They'd agreed to split their joint savings account, a modest $40,000 accumulated over 5 years of marriage, half of which Jennifer had contributed from her salary, while Thomas's consulting income remained mysteriously variable. Jennifer had assumed this meant $20,000 each, a decent enough cushion for her new life with Blake, who'd already hinted at moving in together once the divorce was finalized. The paperwork was scheduled to be signed tonight at their apartment, Thomas's idea of keeping things simple and private. Jennifer had agreed, relieved that he wasn't making this difficult, wasn't demanding explanations or begging for second chances. She'd packed most of her belongings already, boxes stacked in the bedroom she'd shared with a man who now felt like a stranger she'd married out of temporary insanity. Blake had been supportive throughout the process, sending her encouraging texts, promising her that freedom was just one signature away from the life they both deserved together. Jennifer left the bathroom and returned to her desk, her mind already 3 hours ahead to the moment she'd walk out of that apartment for the last time. Her colleague Rebecca Chen stopped by with afternoon coffee, chatting about the upcoming quarterly review and how impressive it was that Jennifer kept getting assigned to the most prestigious projects. Rebecca had been with Hartwell Industries for 8 years, longer than Jennifer, but seemed perpetually stuck at the same mid-level position, despite obvious competence. Jennifer had always found this peculiar, but attributed it to Rebecca's lack of assertiveness, her unwillingness to demand recognition. Rebecca mentioned in passing that the company's actual owner remained anonymous, operating through layers of corporate structure and proxy executives, that nobody had ever met the person who'd founded Hartwell Industries 15 years ago when it was just a 3-person consulting startup. Rumors suggested the founder preferred absolute privacy, possibly for tax reasons or personal security, and maintained control through a labyrinth of shell corporations and legal trusts. Jennifer listened with half attention, more focused on drafting the email to Blake confirming their dinner plans for tomorrow night. Their first public date now that she'd soon be officially single. The workday ended with agonizing slowness, each hour stretching like taffy as Jennifer anticipated her liberation. She'd told Thomas to expect her by 7 o'clock, enough time for rush hour to clear, enough time for her to mentally prepare for what needed to be done. Blake had offered to come with her for moral support, but Jennifer had declined, wanting to handle this final interaction with some dignity, some acknowledgement of the years they'd shared, even if those years now felt like wasted time. She drove home in her practical Toyota Camry, another compromise she'd made for Thomas's comfort with moderation, already fantasizing about the upgrade Blake had promised once they combined their incomes. The apartment building looked particularly depressing in the early November twilight, its brick facade crumbling, its lobby smelling of old cooking and neglect. Jennifer had stopped seeing it years ago, her mind automatically filtering out the reality of where she lived. But tonight the ugliness felt almost poetic, a physical manifestation of everything she was escaping. Thomas was waiting in the living room when she arrived, the divorce papers spread across their cheap IKEA coffee table like accusations. He'd ordered Chinese takeout, the containers still steaming, an oddly domestic touch that irritated Jennifer more than it should have. He looked exactly as he always did, wrinkled button-down shirt stretched across his persistent belly, khakis that had seen better days, worn sneakers instead of proper shoes. His face was pleasant enough, unremarkable features that blended into crowds, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after a conversation ended. He smiled at her with what seemed like genuine warmth, gesturing to the food he'd bought, suggesting they might as well eat before handling the paperwork. Jennifer felt a surge of impatience at his inability to read the moment, his insistence on maintaining normalcy when their entire relationship was being dismantled. She declined the food, said she wanted to just sign and leave. The dragging this out served no purpose. Thomas nodded, understanding flickering across his expression, and slid the papers toward her along with a pen. She read through the document quickly, her eyes catching on the financial settlement section. The joint account would be emptied and closed, the full $40,000 transferred to Jennifer's personal account, Thomas keeping nothing for himself. Jennifer looked up sharply, confusion tempering her irritation. This wasn't what they'd agreed to, wasn't the 50-50 split his lawyer had proposed. Thomas explained calmly that he'd thought about it and decided she'd contributed more to their life together, that she deserved to start fresh with resources he clearly didn't need. His generosity felt like condescension, like pity from someone who had no right to either emotion, and Jennifer's gratitude curdled into something uglier. She asked why he was being so accommodating, whether guilt was finally penetrating his oblivious contentment. Thomas said nothing for a long moment, just studied her face with an intensity she'd never seen before, then told her he'd always wanted her to be happy, even if that happiness excluded him. Jennifer signed the papers with aggressive strokes, her signature a declaration of independence. Thomas witnessed her signature, then signed his own portion, his handwriting surprisingly elegant for someone so careless about appearances. The marriage was over, dissolved by mutual agreement, effective immediately once filed with the court on Monday morning. Jennifer stood to leave, eager to escape the apartment that had represented her stagnation, but Thomas asked her to wait, said there was something else they needed to discuss. She sighed with theatrical impatience, checking her phone where Blake had sent another message asking how things were going, promising her a celebration dinner at that new French restaurant she'd been wanting to try. Thomas went to the bedroom and returned with a bottle of wine, expensive wine by the label, something Jennifer had never seen him purchase in 5 years of marriage. He explained that Blake had left it in the office break room last week, that he'd found it and thought she might want it as a parting gift since she was so eager to start her new life. The comment held an edge Jennifer hadn't expected, a sharpness that didn't match his usual passive accommodation. She asked how he knew about Blake, and Thomas smiled that same warm smile that now looked somehow different, somehow calculating. He said he'd known for months that betrayal had a particular smell in corporate environments, that affairs were rarely as secret as the participants believed. Jennifer felt her face flush with anger at his presumption, his judgment, his implication that he'd been aware and simply allowed himself to be cuckolded. Before she could respond, the apartment door opened and Blake walked in, his key clicking in the lock with proprietary confidence. Jennifer's confusion lasted only a second before realization crashed through her thoughts. She'd given Blake a spare key 2 weeks ago during a moment of champagne-fueled intimacy. Blake looked surprised to see Thomas still present, had clearly expected to find Jennifer alone, ready to celebrate her newly single status. He recovered quickly, though, his corporate charm activating like armor, extending his hand to Thomas with faux magnanimity and offering condolences about the divorce as if he hadn't been the catalyst. Thomas stared at the offered hand for a long moment, something unreadable crossing his features, then stood and walked toward Blake with deliberate slowness. Jennifer expected awkwardness, perhaps some pathetic attempt at masculine posturing from her soon-to-be ex-husband. Instead, Thomas looked Blake directly in the eyes and asked a single question in a voice that didn't sound like his own, didn't sound like the meek consultant she'd married. He asked Blake if he remembered their conversation from 3 months ago, the one where Blake had sworn on their 15-year friendship that he'd never pursue Jennifer, that he valued loyalty above all things. Blake's confident expression faltered, confusion and something like fear flickering across his features. Then Thomas did something that shattered Jennifer's understanding of reality. He pulled out his phone, tapped it twice, and suddenly Blake's own voice filled the apartment through the Bluetooth speaker, crystal clear audio from a recorded conversation. Blake's voice dripped with contempt as he described Thomas as that fat fucking nobody, detailed his seduction of Jennifer as a game, laughed about how easy it had been to manipulate a woman desperate for validation, explained his strategy of using her to gain insider information about Hartwell Industries' confidential projects. Jennifer's blood went cold as she heard herself being described as decent enough in bed, but mostly just a useful idiot with access. Heard Blake speculate about discarding her once he'd extracted enough corporate intelligence to leverage a better position at a competitor company. The recording was dated 4 weeks ago, Blake talking to someone named Richard, bragging about his conquest with the same tone someone might use to describe a successful fishing trip. Jennifer's hands began shaking as the full scope of her stupidity crystallized, as she realized that while she'd thought she was trading up, she'd actually been demoted to pawn in someone else's game. Blake lunged for the phone, trying to grab it from Thomas's hand, his polished veneer cracking to reveal something desperate underneath. Thomas stepped back easily, his movements surprisingly agile for someone she'd always thought of as clumsy and slow. Blake's desperation transformed into rage, the kind of cornered animal fury that precedes violence. He shoved Thomas backward, the force sending her husband stumbling against the wall, and began shouting about privacy violations and illegal recordings. Thomas remained oddly calm, his expression neutral as he weathered Blake's aggression, and this composure seemed to enrage Blake further. He grabbed the wine bottle from the table, the expensive one he'd apparently left at the office, and for a terrible moment Jennifer thought he might actually strike Thomas with it. Instead, Blake did something worse. He opened the bottle, took a long drink, then spat the contents directly into Thomas's face, the wine and saliva mixture dripping down his cheeks and soaking his shirt. Jennifer gasped, shocked by the viciousness of the gesture, by the pure contempt it represented. Blake wasn't finished, though. He began listing Thomas's failures as a man, cataloging his physical inadequacy, his professional mediocrity, his fundamental unworthiness of Jennifer's affection. He told Thomas that he'd done him a favor by taking Jennifer off his hands, that someone so pathetic should be grateful rather than vindictive. The words poured out with increasing cruelty, each insult designed to unmake what little dignity Thomas might have retained. Jennifer felt something crack inside her chest, not sympathy exactly, but a dawning horror at what she'd become, what she'd aligned herself with. The man she'd thought was her escape to a better life was revealing himself as something poisonous, something that diminished everyone it touched. But her horror wasn't strong enough to override her self-preservation, wasn't powerful enough to erase months of fantasies about the life Blake had promised. She found herself laughing, a high, nervous sound that didn't feel like it came from her body. And before she fully understood what she was doing, she'd picked up her own glass of wine from the table and thrown it at Thomas. The red liquid splashed across his face and chest, mixing with Blake's spittle, staining his wrinkled shirt with dark splotches that looked almost like blood. She heard herself echoing Blake's sentiments, calling Thomas a loser, mocking his contentment with failure, thanking him for being smart enough to give her the money to start fresh. The words felt foreign in her mouth, too cruel for who she thought she was. But Blake's approving laughter encouraged her, validated this version of herself that could be vicious when necessary. Thomas stood there dripping with wine and humiliation, his expression still strangely peaceful, and this calm somehow made Jennifer angrier, made her want to provoke some reaction, some acknowledgement that she'd wounded him. Thomas walked to the bathroom and returned with a towel, methodically wiping his face and neck, while Blake and Jennifer watched, united in their contempt. He dried himself with the same patience he brought to everything, his movements unhurried despite the degradation he'd just experienced. When he finished, he folded the towel neatly and set it on the counter, then turned to face them both with eyes that held something Jennifer had never seen before, something that made her instinctively step backward. He told them calmly that they deserved each other, that he hoped they'd be very happy together, that he bore them no ill will despite everything. The words should have sounded bitter, should have dripped with sarcasm, but Thomas delivered them with apparent sincerity that felt more unsettling than rage would have been. Blake laughed, called him pathetic again, asked if he planned to cry about this in his sad little apartment while they celebrated in penthouses. Thomas smiled then, really smiled, and said that celebrations were indeed in order, that he was genuinely happy for them both. He mentioned that he'd heard through mutual friends that they were planning to get married soon, that Blake had already proposed during a weekend trip to the Hamptons, that Jennifer had accepted with enthusiasm. Jennifer's face flushed because this was true, because Blake had surprised her with a ring 3 days ago, because they'd been planning a quick wedding for next month, something small but elegant at a boutique hotel in Connecticut. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a cream-colored envelope, expensive stationery that looked out of place in his cheap apartment. He handed it to Jennifer with a slight bow, mockingly formal, and told her to consider it their wedding invitation, his gift to their future happiness. Jennifer opened it confused, expecting perhaps some final pathetic plea, some last-ditch attempt to win her back. Instead, she found a check made out to her name, $50,000, far more than their joint account had ever contained. Attached was a note in Thomas's elegant handwriting, congratulating them on their upcoming nuptials and insisting they use the money to make their wedding everything they dreamed. Blake snatched the check from her hands, examined it with suspicion, asked where the hell Thomas had gotten this kind of money. Thomas explained casually that he'd made some good investments over the years, that he'd always kept a separate emergency fund Jennifer hadn't known about, that he wanted them to start their marriage properly funded. The explanation sounded plausible enough, but something in his tone suggested layers Jennifer couldn't penetrate, mysteries she'd never bothered to investigate during 5 years of marriage. Blake pocketed the check with greedy satisfaction, told Thomas this was the least he could do after wasting 5 years of Jennifer's life, that maybe there was some decency in him after all. Thomas wished them well one final time, grabbed a jacket from the closet, and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, looked back at Jennifer with an expression she couldn't decipher, and told her she'd been right about one thing. She did deserve better than what he'd given her. Then he left, pulling the door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than a slam. Jennifer stood in the apartment that was now hers alone, surrounded by the boxes of her belongings and the lingering smell of Chinese takeout, feeling simultaneously triumphant and hollow. Blake pulled her into an embrace, kissing her with the possessive intensity she'd craved, promising her that their life together would be everything Thomas had been too limited to provide. They celebrated that night with expensive champagne at Blake's loft, made love in his king-size bed with its 1,000-thread count sheets, planned their wedding with the check Thomas had given them, funding possibilities she'd never imagined. Jennifer fell asleep wrapped in Blake's arms, telling herself this was happiness, this was the life she'd earned, this was justice for years of settling for mediocrity. The divorce would be filed Monday morning, and by next month she'd be Jennifer Davidson, wife of a successful executive, free from the dead weight that had anchored her to ordinary existence. The wedding invitation arrived at Thomas's new address exactly 3 weeks later, delivered by messenger to a post office box he'd rented specifically for this transition period. Jennifer and Blake had moved quickly once the divorce was finalized, eager to cement their union, to declare their victory over conventional morality. The invitation was expensive, embossed lettering on ivory cardstock announcing their marriage at the Riverside Manor in Greenwich, Connecticut on December 15th at 4 p.m, reception to follow. Thomas held the heavy paper in his hands and smiled, that same peaceful smile that had so unnerved Jennifer during their final confrontation. He RSVP'd yes immediately, confirming his attendance with a brief note expressing his joy at their happiness and his eagerness to celebrate this momentous occasion. Jennifer received his response with mixed emotions. Part of her had hoped he'd decline, would spare them all the awkwardness of his presence. But another part felt validated by his willingness to witness her upgrade, to publicly acknowledge that she'd moved beyond him to something superior. Blake found the whole situation amusing, told his groomsmen that his predecessor would be attending the wedding, that they should all witness what happens to men who fail to satisfy their wives' ambitions. The bachelor party conversation turned crude. Speculation about whether Thomas would cry during the ceremony, whether he'd gotten fatter in his loneliness, whether he'd show up drunk and make a scene. December 15th arrived with the crisp cold that makes everything feel sharp and defined, the kind of weather that demands attention and won't permit ambiguity. The Riverside Manor was appropriately elegant, a restored mansion on 3 acres of manicured grounds. Exactly the kind of venue Jennifer had fantasized about during years of imagining herself as someone who mattered. She'd spent Blake's check, Thomas's check technically, but she'd stopped thinking of it that way, on a designer wedding dress that made her look like minor royalty, on flowers that filled the ceremony space with orchestrated beauty, on a 7-tier cake that seemed more like sculpture than food. Blake had invited over 200 guests, a mixture of Hartwell Industries executives, business contacts, old college friends, and family members who'd flown in from across the country. Jennifer's guest list was smaller, her own family less impressed with Blake than she'd hoped, but she'd filled out the numbers with work colleagues who oohed and awed appropriately at the lavishness surrounding them. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock, but by 3:30 most guests had arrived, mingling in the grand foyer with champagne flutes and anticipatory conversation. Jennifer waited in the bridal suite upstairs, her hands trembling slightly with excitement and something else she couldn't quite name, some whisper of unease she attributed to normal wedding anxiety. Thomas arrived at 3:45, his timing precisely calculated to avoid the early crowd, but not late enough to cause disruption. The valet parking attendant took one look at him and tried to direct him to vendor parking, assuming someone dressed in an obviously cheap suit driving a Honda Civic must be delivering something rather than attending. Thomas corrected him politely, handed over his keys, and walked into the manor with the same unhurried gait that had characterized all his movements. He looked exactly as Jennifer remembered, slightly overweight, indifferently dressed, utterly forgettable in his ordinariness. Several guests glanced at him and quickly looked away, their eyes sliding off his unremarkable appearance, their attention returning to more interesting conversation partners. Thomas made his way to the ceremony space, a converted ballroom with chairs arranged in neat rows facing an altar, decorated with white roses and trailing ivy. He selected a seat in the back corner, away from the main sections reserved for family and close friends, positioning himself where he could observe without being observed. Other guests filled in around him, chatting about business and weather and how beautiful the venue was, occasionally glancing at Thomas with mild curiosity before dismissing him as probably someone's boring relative. Blake's best man spotted Thomas during a final pre-ceremony check of the seating arrangements, recognized him from office parties and corporate events, where Jennifer had dragged her husband to networking opportunities he never properly utilized. He rushed to alert Blake, who was adjusting his bow tie in the groom's preparation room, warning him that the ex-husband had actually shown up, that they might want security ready in case things got uncomfortable. Blake laughed, genuinely amused rather than concerned, told his best man that Thomas's presence was actually perfect, that having your wife's former husband watch her marry someone superior was the ultimate validation. He instructed his groomsmen to keep an eye on Thomas during the reception, to make sure he saw every kiss, every first dance, every moment that demonstrated what Jennifer had gained by trading up. Blake felt magnanimous in his victory, secure enough in his conquest to tolerate the presence of the defeated, confident that Thomas's attendance would only highlight the vast gulf between mediocrity and success. He checked himself in the mirror one final time, admired how well his custom tuxedo fit his athletic frame, how his professional teeth whitening made his smile dazzle, how his expensive haircut framed his face with calculated precision. The ceremony began promptly at 4, the string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon as guests settled into their seats. The wedding party proceeded down the aisle in traditional order, bridesmaids in coordinated sage green dresses, groomsmen in matching tuxedos, the flower girl scattering petals with rehearsed precision. Then the music shifted to the wedding march, and Jennifer appeared at the back of the ballroom on her father's arm, backlit by the late afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows, looking exactly like the fairy tale princess she'd always imagined herself becoming. She walked slowly, savoring every step, meeting the eyes of guests who murmured appreciation at her beauty, feeling the weight of admiring gazes like a coronation. Her eyes found Blake at the altar, his expression appropriately awed, his love or reasonable facsimile thereof displayed for everyone to witness. For a moment she let her gaze drift across the assembled guests, cataloging who had come to witness her triumph, and her eyes caught on a figure in the back corner. Thomas sat perfectly still, his face neutral, his hands folded in his lap, watching her processional with the same peaceful expression that had so unnerved her during their final encounter. Jennifer felt a flash of irritation that he'd actually come, that he couldn't give her this moment without his presence casting a shadow. But she pushed the feeling aside and focused on Blake, on the future, on everything she'd gained. The officiant was a friend of Blake's family, a judge who'd agreed to perform the ceremony as a personal favor. And he conducted the proceedings with appropriate gravitas. The vows were traditional, promises of love and loyalty and partnership that both Jennifer and Blake delivered with convincing sincerity. When the judge asked if anyone present had objections to this union, the guests chuckled at the antiquated formality, secure in the knowledge that no one would be dramatic enough to speak. The moment passed without incident, and the ceremony continued toward its inevitable conclusion. Rings were exchanged, expensive platinum bands that Blake had selected from Tiffany, and the judge pronounced them husband and wife with theatrical flourish. Blake kissed Jennifer with Hollywood enthusiasm, dipping her dramatically while guests applauded and camera flashes erupted like small supernovas. Jennifer felt dizzy with happiness, with vindication, with the certainty that she'd finally claimed the life she deserved. They processed back down the aisle as the newly married Davidson couple, guests standing to congratulate them, voices raised in celebration of love's triumph over circumstance. Jennifer deliberately didn't look toward the back corner where Thomas sat, didn't want to taint this perfect moment with reminders of past mistakes. The reception space had been transformed into something from a luxury magazine spread, every detail curated for maximum impact and minimum authenticity. Crystal chandeliers cast flattering light across tables, dressed in silk linens, centerpieces of exotic flowers that probably cost more than most guests' monthly rent, place settings that looked too expensive to actually use for eating. The head table positioned Jennifer and Blake center stage, elevated slightly so everyone could admire them throughout the evening, surrounded by their wedding party who'd been chosen partly for attractiveness and partly for social value. Dinner was a 5-course affair prepared by a celebrity chef Blake had hired at extraordinary expense, each plate a work of art that guests photographed before consuming. Wine flowed freely, expensive vintages that the sommelier described in detail to anyone who'd listen, and the conversation grew progressively louder as inhibitions dissolved in alcohol and celebration. Jennifer felt like she was floating, her champagne buzz mixing with genuine elation, everything she'd imagined about this moment crystallizing into reality. Blake kept his hand possessively on her thigh throughout dinner, occasionally leaning over to whisper crude promises about their wedding night, treating her like a prize he'd won through superior strategy and execution. Thomas remained at his assigned table in a far corner of the reception space, positioned with other low-priority guests who'd been invited more out of obligation than genuine desire for their presence. He ate his dinner quietly, complimented the food to his table mates, engaged in polite small talk about weather and traffic without revealing anything substantive about himself. The other guests at his table had determined within 15 minutes that he wasn't worth cultivating for networking purposes, and they'd shifted their attention to more promising social opportunities, leaving Thomas essentially alone, despite being surrounded by people. He seemed content with this isolation, sipping his wine slowly, watching the celebration unfold with an expression that might have been happiness or might have been something else entirely. As the evening progressed and the champagne kept flowing, Blake's groomsmen began making increasingly obvious remarks about the ex still hanging around, loud enough for Thomas to hear, speculating about whether he was hoping Jennifer would change her mind, whether he'd brought a sad little gift, whether he understood that some men were simply born to be replaced by better models. Thomas showed no reaction to these provocations, just continued eating his overpriced dinner with the same patient attention he'd brought to everything in his life. After dinner came the traditional reception performances: first dance, father-daughter dance, cake cutting, bouquet toss, all the ritualized moments that transform a party into a wedding. Jennifer and Blake's first dance was choreographed. They'd taken lessons specifically for this moment, and they executed their routine with the polish of people who'd invested serious time in appearances. Guests formed a circle around them, clapping in rhythm, pulling out phones to record this display of romantic coordination. When the dance ended, Blake spun Jennifer dramatically and dipped her low, holding the position long enough for every camera to capture the moment, then pulled her up into a kiss that seemed designed more for the audience than for intimacy. The DJ transitioned smoothly into an upbeat song that invited everyone onto the dance floor, and the reception transformed into the kind of corporate party Jennifer had always envied from the outside. Attractive people performing wealth and success with their bodies and their laughter. Blake was pulled away by a group of executives who wanted to congratulate him, to slap his back and make jokes about ball and chain, to bond over shared masculine anxiety about commitment dressed up as humor. Jennifer found herself momentarily alone, surveying her triumph, feeling the pleasant exhaustion of being the center of attention for hours. She decided this was the perfect moment to confront Thomas, to ensure he understood exactly what he'd lost, to make absolutely certain he felt the full weight of her upgrade. She spotted him still sitting at his corner table, nursing what appeared to be his second glass of wine, watching the dancing with that same infuriating, peaceful expression. Jennifer walked toward him with the particular grace that comes from wearing an expensive dress and knowing you look good in it, her confidence amplified by champagne and validation. She arrived at his table and sat down uninvited, arranging her dress carefully, looking at him with a mixture of pity and triumph that she didn't bother to disguise. She asked him why he'd really come, what he'd hoped to accomplish by witnessing her marriage to someone so obviously superior. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his eyes traveling across her face with an attention that felt uncomfortably penetrating, then told her simply that he'd come to say goodbye properly, to see her happy before he moved on with his own life. Jennifer felt a flash of genuine curiosity. Moved on how exactly? Was there some other unfortunate woman willing to settle for his mediocrity? Thomas smiled that mysterious smile and said he was relocating for work, taking a position that required his full attention, leaving New York behind for new opportunities. Before Jennifer could respond, Blake appeared at her shoulder, his hand immediately going to the back of her neck in a gesture of possession. He looked down at Thomas with unconcealed contempt, asked loudly enough for nearby tables to hear if Jennifer's ex was boring her with stories about his exciting life of failure and obscurity. Thomas stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and faced Blake with an expression that had shifted slightly, hardened around the edges. He extended his hand for a handshake, the same gesture Blake had offered in the apartment weeks ago. And Blake took it automatically, conditioned by years of corporate networking to accept offered hands. Thomas's grip tightened, not painfully but firmly enough to command attention, and he leaned in close, speaking directly into Blake's ear. Jennifer couldn't hear what he said, but she saw Blake's expression change, saw color drain from his face, saw something like fear flicker across his features. When Thomas released his hand and stepped back, Blake looked like he'd been struck, his confident posture crumbling slightly, his smooth facade developing cracks. Thomas thanked them both for a lovely evening, congratulated them again on their marriage, and told Jennifer with apparent sincerity that he hoped Blake gave her everything she'd been looking for. Then Thomas walked toward the exit, his path taking him past the head table where the wedding party still celebrated, past the dance floor where executives performed corporate bonding disguised as recreation, past the open bar where guests networked over premium liquor. As he reached the grand foyer, he paused and turned back, his eyes scanning the reception space one final time. What happened next would be debated by guests for months afterward, analyzed and reanalyzed until the truth became obscured by competing narratives. Thomas pulled out his phone, typed something quickly, and within seconds, every light in the Riverside Manor went out simultaneously, plunging the reception into absolute darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in after 3 seconds, dim battery-powered bulbs that cast everything in an eerie twilight. And in that strange half-light, Thomas's voice came through the venue's sound system, amplified and crystal clear. He thanked everyone for attending this celebration, hoped they'd enjoyed the food and wine and entertainment, and wanted to share some information that might contextualize the evening more accurately. His voice was calm, almost conversational, the tone you'd use to discuss weather rather than detonate explosions. Thomas explained to the 200 assembled guests that Blake Davidson, the groom they'd come to celebrate, was currently under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for insider trading, specifically for using confidential information stolen from Hartwell Industries to make illegal stock purchases through shell corporations. The investigation had been ongoing for 4 months, quietly building a case that would be made public within the next 72 hours, likely resulting in federal charges that carried a minimum sentence of 5 years in prison. Thomas's voice continued, detailing specific trades Blake had made, naming the shell companies he'd created, citing dollar amounts and dates with the precision of someone who'd reviewed the evidence personally. The reception space had gone completely silent, guests frozen in place trying to process what they were hearing. Blake started shouting, denying everything, calling Thomas a liar, demanding someone shut off the sound system, but his voice couldn't compete with the amplification, and his panic only made Thomas's calm recitation more credible. Thomas went on to explain that Blake's employment with Hartwell Industries would be terminated Monday morning, that his professional reputation would be destroyed, that every asset he'd bragged about, the loft, the Tesla, the investment portfolio, would be seized by federal authorities as proceeds of illegal activity. Then Thomas shifted his attention to Jennifer, and his voice took on a different quality, something sadder but no less measured. He told her that everything Blake had promised her was built on stolen money and illegal activities, that the man she'd married was facing financial ruin and imprisonment, that the life she'd imagined with him was a fantasy that would collapse within days. He apologized for not telling her sooner, explained that he'd needed to be certain before making accusations, that he'd wanted to give her one last chance to reconsider before the truth became public. But since she'd made her choice, since she'd thrown wine in his face and laughed at his supposed mediocrity, he'd decided she deserved to experience exactly the life she'd chosen. The emergency lights flickered, and suddenly the massive screens that had been displaying photos of Jennifer and Blake throughout their relationship changed, now showing documents, SEC filings, bank statements, email correspondence between Blake and his broker, text messages where Blake had bragged about his scheme to that same friend Richard from the earlier recording. 200 guests stared at evidence of systematic criminal activity displayed in high definition. Watch Blake's carefully constructed image dissolve into something ugly and prosecutable. Blake tried to run, actually tried to flee the reception, but found the exits blocked by men in dark suits who identified themselves as federal agents, who'd been positioned around the venue for the past hour, who'd been waiting for this exact moment. They approached Blake calmly, badges displayed, rights being read, handcuffs clicking into place with a finality that silenced every whisper. Jennifer stood frozen in her wedding dress, her champagne flute slipping from nerveless fingers and shattering on the expensive floor, her mind struggling to reconcile the past 3 hours of celebration with the nightmare currently unfolding. She looked around desperately for Thomas, found him still standing in the foyer, watching Blake's arrest with that same peaceful expression. Their eyes met across the dimly lit space, and Jennifer saw something in his face that made her stomach drop. Not cruelty, not triumph, just a deep sadness mixed with resignation. Thomas had known this would happen, had planned for this moment, had let her marry Blake with full knowledge that the marriage would be destroyed before the honeymoon. As federal agents led Blake away, his tuxedo looking suddenly ridiculous in the context of handcuffs, one of them paused near Thomas and nodded respectfully, a gesture of acknowledgement between colleagues. Jennifer's mind, desperately trying to make sense of what she was witnessing, latched on to this interaction, began building connections she'd been too blind to see. Thomas remained in the foyer while the reception space descended into chaos, guests pulling out phones to call lawyers and publicists, wedding party members distancing themselves from the catastrophe, vendors beginning the awkward process of cleaning up a celebration that had become a crime scene. The venue manager approached Thomas hesitantly, asked if the bill for the evening would still be honored given the circumstances. Thomas assured her calmly that all expenses had already been paid in full, that the food and service had been excellent, that she shouldn't worry about financial repercussions from the evening's events. The manager looked confused, checked her paperwork, confirmed that the $50,000 deposit had indeed come from an account linked to Thomas Morrison, not Blake Davidson as she'd assumed. Jennifer watched this interaction from across the foyer, her wedding dress suddenly feeling like a costume, her triumph curdling into horror and confusion. She approached Thomas on unsteady feet, her voice barely functional, and asked the question she should have asked 5 years ago. Who was he really? Thomas looked at her with something that might have been fondness or might have been pity, and explained gently that he was exactly who he'd always been, a consultant who preferred privacy, someone who'd built a successful career analyzing systems and finding vulnerabilities, a person who'd married her because she'd seemed genuine in a world full of performance. He'd never lied to her, he explained, had simply never volunteered information she'd never asked for, had allowed her to make assumptions based on appearances rather than reality. The consulting contracts that moved him between companies had been his own choice, preferring project-based work to permanent employment, enjoying the flexibility of not being tied to any single organization's politics. The modest apartment and old car had been deliberate choices, not financial necessities, part of a lifestyle that valued privacy and normalcy over display and vulnerability. Jennifer's legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the foyer floor, her expensive dress pooling around her like a melted wedding cake. She asked in a whisper if he'd known about Blake from the beginning, if he'd watched her fall into this trap without warning her. Thomas knelt beside her, his bulk settling with surprising grace, and explained that he'd discovered Blake's criminal activities 3 months ago while conducting a routine audit for Hartwell Industries, that he'd been building the case since then, that he'd reported everything to the SEC and the FBI, that he'd been cooperating with their investigation as a confidential witness. When Blake had started his affair with Jennifer, Thomas had been faced with an impossible choice: reveal Blake's criminality and look like a jealous husband trying to sabotage his wife's new relationship, or stay silent and let Jennifer make her own decisions. He'd chosen silence, hoping that Jennifer would see through Blake's performance before things went too far. But she hadn't, and so Thomas had done the only thing he could. He'd ensured that when the consequences arrived, they'd be complete and undeniable, that Jennifer wouldn't be able to rationalize or minimize what Blake really was. The guests were leaving now, streaming out of the venue in clusters, phones pressed to ears, voices raised in excited gossip, already crafting the stories they'd tell about the wedding that became a federal arrest. Jennifer's family approached cautiously, her mother's face a mask of barely concealed, "I told you so," her father's expression mixing anger and concern. Thomas stood and greeted them politely, took responsibility for the disruption, apologized for ruining their daughter's wedding day. Jennifer's father, who'd never particularly liked Thomas, but had respected his steady devotion to Jennifer, asked him bluntly what happened to the quiet consultant they'd met 7 years ago. Thomas smiled sadly and said that person still existed, had never stopped existing, had simply been invisible to people who didn't care to look closely. He shook her father's hand, hugged her mother briefly, and told them to take care of Jennifer, that she'd need support in the coming weeks as Blake's prosecution moved forward. Then he walked toward the exit, his cheap suit and worn shoes carrying him across marble floors toward the valet station. Jennifer found her voice finally, called out his name with desperation that surprised her. Thomas paused but didn't turn around, waiting for whatever she needed to say. She asked through tears if he'd done all this for revenge, if destroying her wedding day had made him feel powerful, if he'd enjoyed watching her humiliation. Thomas turned slowly, his face gentle but firm, and told her this had never been about revenge or punishment. He'd done this to protect her from fully entangling her life with a criminal, from potentially being charged as an accomplice to Blake's schemes, from wasting more years with someone who'd been using her as an asset rather than loving her as a person. The timing had been deliberate, yes. Letting her marry Blake before the arrest ensured she'd see the truth before the honeymoon fantasy could fully take root, before she'd invested more than just one day in the illusion. It was cruel to be kind, perhaps, but Thomas had decided that short-term humiliation was preferable to long-term catastrophe. Jennifer wanted to scream at him, to blame him for everything, but somewhere beneath her shock and horror, she recognized the truth in what he was saying, understood that he'd probably saved her from federal investigation or worse. Thomas walked to his waiting Honda Civic, tipped the valet generously, and drove away from the Riverside Manor without looking back. Jennifer stood in the foyer of her destroyed wedding reception, her designer dress stained with champagne and tears, surrounded by the ruins of every plan she'd made. The venue staff began breaking down tables and packing up centerpieces with the efficient melancholy of people who'd seen parties end badly before. Jennifer's phone buzzed with messages from colleagues at Hartwell Industries, everyone suddenly very interested in her relationship with Blake, everyone wanting to know how much she'd known about his illegal activities. She realized with dawning horror that her career was probably over too, that regardless of her actual innocence, association with Blake would taint her professionally, that the promotions and opportunities she'd enjoyed might now be scrutinized as potential involvement in his schemes. Everything she'd built, everything she'd sacrificed her marriage for, was collapsing like a tower built on sand. She pulled off her wedding rings, the platinum bands Blake had selected to symbolize their eternal bond, and held them in her palm, their weight suddenly unbearable. Her mother sat down beside her on the cold marble floor, wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and for the first time in years, Jennifer allowed herself to cry without caring about makeup or appearances. She cried for her stupidity, for her cruelty to Thomas, for the life she'd destroyed chasing a fantasy of success that turned out to be criminal fiction. She cried because she'd thrown wine in the face of a man who'd apparently loved her enough to save her, despite her betrayal, who'd endured her contempt and Blake's spittle and public humiliation to ensure she didn't end up in federal prison. Her mother held her without speaking, letting Jennifer's sobs echo through the emptying venue. And after a long time, her father's voice cut through the crying with a simple observation. At least now she knew what kind of man she'd been married to, and what kind she'd thrown away. The days following the wedding arrest were a special kind of hell Jennifer hadn't imagined possible. Blake's prosecution moved forward with the mechanical inevitability of federal bureaucracy, his crimes detailed in press releases and news articles that portrayed him as exactly the kind of corporate predator people love to hate. Jennifer's name appeared in several articles as the bride present during Davidson's arrest, her humiliation documented for public consumption, her wedding photos juxtaposed with mugshots and a cautionary tale about white-collar crime. Hartwell Industries placed her on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into whether she'd benefited from or contributed to Blake's insider trading. Colleagues who'd congratulated her on her promotion months ago now avoided her calls, and her professional reputation, everything she'd cared about more than her marriage, disintegrated faster than she could defend it. The $50,000 Thomas had given them for the wedding was seized by federal authorities as potential proceeds of illegal activity, despite Thomas's attempts to prove it came from his personal funds. The wedding dress, the decorations, the non-refundable deposits, all of it became financial loss added to emotional devastation. Jennifer moved back in with her parents, unable to afford her apartment, on a salary that had disappeared with her job, and spent her days reviewing her memories of the past year, looking for signs she'd missed, clues she'd ignored. The evidence had been everywhere if she'd bothered to look. Blake's vague explanations about his investment success, his unusual interest in her work projects, his questions about confidential company information disguised as pillow talk. She'd been so blinded by his attention, so desperate to believe she'd found someone who valued her ambition, that she'd actively ignored every red flag. Most painful was reviewing her treatment of Thomas, remembering the contempt in her voice when she'd called him a loser, the laughter when she'd thrown wine in his face, the casual cruelty of inviting him to watch her marry his betrayer. Thomas hadn't responded to any of her attempts at contact, had apparently moved away as he'd mentioned, leaving no forwarding information. She'd destroyed him for being ordinary, mocked him for being content, and he'd responded by saving her from herself. 3 months after the wedding arrest, Jennifer received a package at her parents' house. No return address, postmarked from Washington, D.C. Inside was a letter and several documents that would take her days to fully process. The letter was from Thomas, handwritten in his elegant script, explaining things he'd never told her during their marriage. He began by apologizing for the deception, acknowledging that his privacy had probably hurt her, even though she'd never seemed interested in his professional life. Thomas explained that he'd founded Hartwell Industries 15 years ago as a 3-person consulting startup, had grown it systematically into a multinational corporation worth billions, had deliberately structured his ownership through layers of legal entities to maintain personal privacy and security. He'd learned early in his career that wealth made you a target for lawsuits, for kidnapping, for people who wanted your money rather than your company. And so he'd built systems to separate his identity from his assets, to live normally while managing extraordinary resources. When Thomas had met Jennifer at that company mixer 7 years ago, he'd been dealing with the aftermath of a relationship that had disintegrated once his wealth became known. A woman who transformed from genuine partner into a resource extractor overnight. He'd been heavier then because stress eating was his coping mechanism, and Jennifer's apparent indifference to his weight or status had felt like salvation. For the first time in years, someone had liked him for himself rather than his portfolio, had chosen him despite his physical appearance rather than because of his financial assets. So he'd married her without disclosing his wealth, wanting to preserve that feeling of being valued for who he was rather than what he owned. It had worked for 3 years, and Thomas had been genuinely happy even in their modest apartment, even driving his old car, even pretending to be a mid-level consultant. He'd engineered Jennifer's promotions at Hartwell from behind the scenes, pleased that he could support her ambition without her knowing, giving her opportunities to succeed on her own merit while ensuring she got the recognition she deserved. But Thomas acknowledged in his letter that his deception had been unfair, that Jennifer had made life decisions based on incomplete information, that her frustration with his apparent lack of ambition was partially his fault for not being honest about his success. When she'd started her affair with Blake, Thomas had felt a familiar pain, the realization that ultimately Jennifer cared more about appearances and status than about their partnership, that she'd probably always been destined to leave once someone flashier came along. He'd hired investigators who'd uncovered Blake's criminal activities within weeks, and Thomas had been faced with the choice of exposing everything immediately or letting the situation play out. He'd chosen the latter because he'd wanted Jennifer to see clearly what she was choosing, wanted her to experience the full consequences of valuing performance over substance. The wedding arrest hadn't been revenge, Thomas insisted, but education, a final gift from someone who'd loved her enough to show her the truth, even when it meant causing her pain. The documents accompanying the letter were divorce papers, signed by Thomas and already filed with the court, finalizing their separation with generous terms. Thomas had transferred $5 million to a trust in Jennifer's name, structured so she'd receive a monthly allowance for life, but couldn't access the principal, protecting her from both poverty and her own potential bad decisions. He'd also included a reference letter for her professional rehabilitation, carefully worded to make clear she'd had no involvement in Blake's crimes, written on Hartwell Industries' letterhead and signed by the corporation's anonymous founder. Thomas explained that he'd already spoken with the SEC and FBI, had vouched for her innocence, had ensured she wouldn't face charges related to Blake's prosecution. This was his final gift, he wrote: financial security and a clean professional slate, the foundation to rebuild whatever life she chose. He asked for nothing in return, wanted no contact, hoped only that she'd learn from this experience and choose more carefully in the future. The letter ended with a simple goodbye, and Thomas's signature had a finality that suggested he meant it. Jennifer sat on her childhood bed, surrounded by documents that proved her ex-husband was one of the wealthiest men in America, that she'd been living in poverty while married to a billionaire, that she'd thrown away financial security most people couldn't imagine because she'd been too shallow to see past appearances. The irony was so perfect it almost seemed designed, a morality tale about greed and blindness dressed up as a failed marriage. She thought about Thomas sitting in that apartment watching documentaries while secretly running a corporate empire, about him enduring her complaints about money while having more than she could spend in 10 lifetimes, about him taking abuse from Blake while holding the power to destroy them both with a phone call. He'd given her exactly what she'd claimed to want, the truth about status and ambition, and the lesson had broken her completely. Blake was in federal prison now, serving 8 years for securities fraud, and Jennifer heard through mutual acquaintances that he blamed her for everything, claimed she'd been working with Thomas from the beginning to set him up, rewrote their entire relationship as a conspiracy rather than admit he'd been caught. Jennifer never saw Thomas again. She heard updates occasionally through the professional grapevine. Hartwell Industries had grown even larger, had acquired several competitors, had become one of the most influential corporations in their sector. The founder's identity remained officially secret, though Jennifer now understood dozens of small details that should have revealed the truth if she'd been paying attention. She used the trust Thomas had established to go back to school, earned an MBA, rebuilt her career slowly and carefully at a smaller firm where nobody cared about her past. She never married again, never even dated seriously, too aware of her own capacity for self-deception to trust her judgment about potential partners. Sometimes late at night she'd pull out the letter Thomas had written, read his careful explanation of why he'd done what he'd done, and feel the weight of everything she'd destroyed through her own ambition and blindness. The fat man she'd mocked had been extraordinary all along, and she'd been too ordinary to recognize it. That was the revenge he'd taken, not the wedding arrest, not the public humiliation, but the simple act of letting her see clearly who she really was and what she'd really valued. And unlike Blake's federal sentence, Jennifer's punishment had no release date, no timeline for when the guilt and regret might finally fade into something manageable. She'd destroyed the best thing in her life while chasing illusions, and Thomas had made certain she'd never forget the cost of that choice.